Bienvenidos una vez más a otro webinar con clúster industrial. En esta ocasión se abordará el tema Cómo prevenir la escasez de semiconductores y otras futuras interrupciones de la cadena de suministro. Nos acompaña Gonzalo Vega, Global Account Manager de QAD. Él ha sido consultor de negocios con más de 22 años de experiencia y ha ayudado a las empresas manufactureras en la optimización de sus procesos logísticos, en la cadena de suministros, en la planificación de fabricación y distribución. Es experto en aplicaciones empresariales de QAD, Cloud Adaptive, ERP, CRM, EAM, QMS, CSS, entre otros. Además, Gonzalo imparte cursos y asesorías de MMOGLE y actualmente se enfoca en el sector automotriz, la industria de alimentos y bebidas y productos de consumo y ciencias de la vida. Muchas gracias por tu participación, Gonzalo. Te cedo la palabra.
Muchas gracias, Martín, y buenos días a todos y bienvenidos a nuestro webinar que tiene un título pues muy actual a lo que estamos viviendo hoy día. ¿Cómo prevenir la próxima escasez de chips semiconductores? Yo podría agregar y de otros elementos o materias primas para futuras interrupciones en la cadena de suministro. Mi nombre es Gonzalo Vega, gerente de cuentas globales para Latinoamérica en QAD México. Este webinar es posible gracias a Kistem y QAD, con la colaboración de Clúster Industrial, a quienes agradecemos por el apoyo en la realización de este evento. Nuestro principal objetivo el día de hoy es que ustedes puedan aprender algo nuevo, algo que puedan poner en práctica y que nos ayude tanto a ustedes como a sus organizaciones a tener éxito en este tiempo disruptivo en el que estamos viviendo. El día de hoy vamos a tener dos ponentes. Katy Fisher, fundadora y presidente de Kistem LLC. Ella es una experta en ISO 9001, IATF 16949 y todos los temas relacionados con calidad. Por otro lado, tenemos a Terry Onica, directora automotriz en QAD, experta en MMGLE y todo lo relacionado con los vehículos. Algunas instrucciones breves antes de comenzar. Este webinar tendrá una duración aproximada de 40 minutos. Cualquier duda que tengan la podrán enviar a nuestra información de contacto que aparecerá al final de la presentación. Este webinar será grabado y lo compartiremos con ustedes tan pronto esté disponible. Muchas gracias por su asistencia. Comenzamos. El día de hoy estaremos revisando 4 puntos principales dentro de la agenda. ¿Cuál es el estado actual de la cadena de suministro automotriz? Vamos igualmente a revisar 24 procesos esenciales dentro de la cadena de suministro. Y muy importante, ¿cuáles son las acciones que vamos a tomar para prevenir la escasez de materias primas en el futuro? Vamos a ver algunos puntos prácticos que puedan llevar y aplicar en sus empresas. Y finalmente, ¿cómo QAD puede ayudarles? Y bueno, creo que de todos es conocido el impacto que ha sufrido la industria automotriz. Los fabricantes pronosticaban que al inicio de este año estaríamos superando la crisis de los semiconductores por ahí de la mitad del año. La realidad es que ya estamos en agosto y con esta tercera ola, la realidad es que seguimos gasto de los semiconductores. Los semiconductores, ustedes saben, se utilizan para la fabricación de chips que van dentro de muchos componentes dentro de los vehículos, sistemas de frenos, los componentes que tenemos en el tablero, sistemas de infoentretenimiento. Al día de hoy, la producción mexicana de vehículos ligeros cayó un 26.5% con respecto a julio del 2020, mientras que las exportaciones han bajado en un 23.63%. La buena noticia es que la producción va mejorando y una vez que tengamos el suministro de los elementos, vamos a poder recuperar los niveles adecuados que teníamos antes de la pandemia. Y muy bien, el día de hoy vamos a mostrar una grabación de video. Este webinar fue grabado en inglés. Lo que hicimos fue agregar los subtítulos para que sea más fácilmente comprensible por todos. Así que adelante con el video, por favor.
Hello, my name is Kathy Fisher, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar on preventing the next semiconductor shortage and other future supply chain disruptions. Today, I'm joined by my colleague, Terry Onica, the Director of Automotive for QAD, and we're going to share with you our perspectives on why the current semiconductor shortage has created so much disruption in the automotive supply chain and how to prevent future disruptions. So what we're going to cover in today's session is the current state of the automotive supply chain. We'll also look into the 3 systemic root causes that we've discovered that are behind many supply chain performance issues. We're also going to share with you the importance of strengthening your supply chain and why it's so urgent right now. And we'll share with you a 5-step roadmap that we've developed for improving your organization's supply chain performance, which is based on 24 essential supply chain processes that we've identified. We're also going to specifically focus in on some actions that your organization can take to prevent the next semiconductor shortage and how you can learn more about improving your organization's supply chain performance. So let's start by taking a look at what's going on in the news right now in terms of the semiconductor shortage. Certainly, many of you have heard that there is great losses in the automotive supply chain globally, not only 6 million vehicles lost in terms of production, but even the numbers that we saw earlier this week are pointing to 6.9 million, almost 7 million units of production lost in global automotive industry. That's right now translating to about $110 billion of lost revenue for automotive manufacturers. But this is what's surprising. The semiconductor shortage that we're experiencing right now, it's not the first time. If you look, Reuters wrote back in May 2010 about a semiconductor shortage and other electronic component shortage that was caused by the tsunami. And certainly that lasted over a year and impacted many of the automotive suppliers, especially in Southeast Asia. How can we address what's gone wrong in the current semiconductor shortage so that to make sure that we don't experience the same type of crisis in our automotive supply chain in the future? Well, we first of all need to understand what went wrong in the first place with this current semiconductor shortage. And there's a lot of similarities to what we saw in previous supply chain disruptions in the automotive industry. First of all, we started with fluctuating customer as well as consumer demand relative to automotive supply. And in particular, starting up after the COVID shutdown last summer, we saw many automotive customers hesitating to increase their automotive requirements in their forecast to their suppliers. Therefore, a lot of suppliers were caught off guard as later in the year, automotive customers quickly increased their forecast because of consumer demand. We've also seen typical issues with deployment of the demand throughout the supply chain. And this is not unique to this semiconductor shortage. This is actually something that we see ongoing in the automotive industry, that demand is not always consistently communicated down throughout the supply chain, especially to those lower tier and raw material suppliers, so that they can ensure consistent supply even when there's fluctuations in demand. We've also experienced situations where inadequate lead times are causing issues for those lower tier suppliers, especially raw material suppliers, to have enough material available to bring that forward to the supply chain demand. We also have seen a lot of organizations not focusing on their supplier performance and consistently reviewing how their suppliers are doing relative to implementing customer and other supply chain requirements, especially in terms of communication of requirements down the supply chain to their suppliers. And of course, one of the biggest issues we're seeing is insufficient visibility of inventory throughout the supply chain. And partly that's due to the lack of automation and integration of automotive supply chain processes. Now, certainly this supply chain, this semiconductor shortage is a bit more of an issue simply because now we are competing with many other industries for certain commodities, in this case semiconductors. And certainly when the demand is there in consumer products, that's unfortunately going to win out over the demand from automotive. And we're a bit late to the party in increasing our requirements after the COVID shutdown. So really, what is behind this crisis? Why is it so widespread and pervasive? And why is it going to last for so long and have such a great impact on the automotive supply chain? Well, firstly, we find that many organizations are still depending on manual processes to manage their forecasting and their supply demand, even their inventory activities. They're defaulting to Excel spreadsheets to understand how to process their requirements down through their supply chain. And by the time that information gets to the lower tiers of the supply chain, it's too late and they're not able to respond to quick changes in demand. We also see poor inventory management and, as we mentioned, a lack of full inventory visibility throughout the supply chain. So there's a lot of guessing going on at those lower tier suppliers in anticipation of what their customer forecasts are going to eventually look like. And of course, every organization faces this concern about not having enough parts on hand because nobody wants to be responsible for shutting down the production process. Now, all of this really comes back to having slow manual communication of these demand requirements throughout the supply chain and not having integrated automated systems to better manage these fluctuations in our customer demand. As we've studied the problem with supply chains in the automotive industry over the past several years, we've discovered that there's 3 root causes at the system level that are really promoting so many of the disruptions that we've been experiencing. The first is that there's not a clear understanding of what are the supply chain processes that are most critical to ensuring consistent performance in terms of supply throughout the supply chain all the way to the consumers. This is going to be a critical issue for us as we move forward because our consumers are expecting their vehicles a lot faster than in the past. There's not going to be the inventory sitting on those dealership lots that we've seen historically, especially as we come out of the semiconductor crisis. We have also recognized significant gaps in knowledge and competency within supply chain organizations. And we've seen a big brain drain in the automotive industry over the past decade because of many retirements and not many young people pursuing careers in our industry sector. Coupled with not really having a good definition of what those supply chain processes are that are essential to good performance in terms of delivery, we really have a recipe for big problems that are going to be long lasting unless we address these systemic issues. And finally, and probably most critical to these problems that we've been experiencing in the supply chain is a lack of automation as well as integration of these processes to the overall business environment. And this is not just automation within individual organizations in the automotive supply chain, but automation across the supply chain as well. Now you might wonder, why is this so important right now? Why do we have to address these systemic root causes right now? Well, Terry and I like to refer to this as the Amazon effect. You probably have heard of this. The Amazon effect is that experience that all of us have had to, up to now, especially through the COVID pandemic, when many of us turned to online ordering to purchase anything from our groceries all the way to vehicles. And we're even seeing much more online buying of vehicles. That is going to be a trend that's going to continue long into the future. In fact, Volvo announced last year that they're shifting all of their sales to online with their EV lines, such as Polestar. Now just think about this. Are you willing to order your car online and wait for months or possibly even years to receive your car? I don't think so. You're probably going to expect delivery as quick as you expect delivery of anything else from Amazon within 2 days. The back end of our automotive supply chain right now is really not designed or functioning to perform at that level. And we need to increase our pace of how we can manage our automotive supply chain effectively in order to overcome the Amazon effect. Coupled with the Amazon effect, we also have a big transformation that's happening in the automotive industry. You folks are pretty familiar, I'm sure, with the term automotive supply chain. And indeed, up to now, we've really operated very much in this linear fashion in our supply chain management. Oftentimes, we're only focused on that customer who's right in front of us or the supplier that's right behind us, and we're hoping they're going to take care of the communications and the management of data within their own supply chains. But as we move towards electrification and autonomous vehicle technology, we're going to see a whole different landscape that makes up what's traditionally known as the automotive supply chain. In fact, we're changing that terminology now to call it an automotive supply ecosystem, because the players that are going to be involved in delivering good quality cars on time to our customers are not just going to be the dealerships, and it's not just the OEMs and the traditional component supply chain. We have other industry players such as software providers, mobility service providers, transportation providers, as well as vehicle service parts and repair providers. So you can see that we have to have a coordination around all of these different elements that may now make up the automotive supply ecosystem in order to effectively deliver on the promise of delivery. Terry and I have identified a 5-step roadmap to help organizations as well as the overall automotive industry improve supply chain performance based on the research that we've done and many interviews with automotive suppliers. What we've discovered is, first and foremost, we have to address the lack of understanding of what those essential supply chain processes are in the automotive industry. We've actually identified 24 of those. We'll share those with you in just a moment. Now, once we have a clear understanding of what those essential supply chain processes are, we've got to turn our attention to understanding the current level of competency within the industry related to those processes, and then fill in the gaps with training and other knowledge development so that we can secure the supply chain processes with the people that are necessary to make them work. We also are encouraging organizations to shift towards what we refer to as a supply chain focus. Traditionally in the automotive industry, the idea has been that money is made on the shop floor, but the reality going forward is that really the money is made in the supply chain by having the right product in the right market at the right quantity at the right time. It's all about the supply chain. And we have to get organizations throughout the automotive supply chain recognizing that that is a critical strategic focus for their business. And then finally, organizations having an understanding of those essential supply chain processes and developing the people in the organization to support them can then look towards automating those processes as well as integrating those processes into their organization's business activities. So I mentioned that we identified 24 supply chain processes from our research that we're going to call essential supply chain processes. We map these processes to the 5 areas of business and recognize that these areas of the business really integrate well with quality management systems as well as other aspects of business operations. We're encouraging organizations to take a look at these 24 topics and recognize the current status of these processes in their organization and determine where they may have gaps so that they can enhance their supply chain and quality management systems in an integrated fashion towards better delivery performance to their automotive customers.
What I want to do now is give you a general overview on how you can apply those 24 essential supply chain topics that Kathy just discussed. In the following slides, I'm going to illustrate this using the semiconductor shortage as an example. As we all know, once you have good documented processes in place, then you can train the people and then you can apply the technology. So let's get started. The first thing that we should do in the semiconductor shortage, a lesson learned, is ensuring that the transmission frequency and the horizon are adequate for the long lead time or critical parts. So early in my career, I had an opportunity. I worked at a seating supplier where the cloth supplier was saying we need 16 weeks of lead time at least because that's how long it actually takes to grow cotton. In our case, cotton was the same issue that we're having with the semiconductor. And so what we did is we sat around with the OEMs and the 4 tiers in the supply chain, and we talked about how much demand needed to be passed down the supply chain. At the time, the OEMs were giving us 26 to 52 weeks of forecast, but what we were doing is we were cutting it off and we were only giving 9 weeks of forecast to the next tier. So we were taking away all that visibility. And the lower tiers of the supply chain are saying, give us as much as we can. We need is complete visibility because as demand changes, it's very hard for them to tell that something's turned when they can't see that visibility, in this case from week 10 to week 16. So it's really important that you look at that lead time, information lead time you need in the supply chain. And then also making sure that you are sending your forecast information at least once a week down the supply chain, right? We want to make sure we're continually passing that information down. And if it changes, then we may have to pass it down sooner. So this is the first area where we could apply lessons learned and make sure that we correct this going forward. The second area is in the procurement and inventory policies. Now, after the 2010 semiconductor shortage, I know a lot of OEMs actually learned this lesson and started to implement inventory policies, especially in the case of electronics. it was typically anywhere from 22 to 26 weeks that they wanted to have for their inventory policy. What we found, though, is I'm not sure anybody was really checking that over the past few years, because if we were checking that policy to make sure between the OEM and the Tier 1 that policy was being adhered to, and then between the Tier 1 and the Tier 2 and on down the supply chain, I think we could have mitigated some of this, but that wasn't happening. So the next lesson that we really should do is sit around and make sure, again, we communicate that inventory policy, whatever it may need to be, for critical and long lead time parts. The next area that we need to look at, and Kathy and I have a lot of experience around this working with people at manufacturing plants, is contingency and risk planning. It's typically on the supply chain side not done so well. It's done poorly for the most part. We see the lack of risk plans, or in many cases they have a risk plan, but it's just not robust enough. So the other really key lesson learned here is to go back and look at our risk plans in all aspects, especially for critical and long lead time parts. What can we do, number one, to prevent the issue, but if we are going to have an issue, what are we going to do when that happens? So again, it's good that we go back and we sit around and we look at all of our suppliers and identify those who are long lead time and critical, and make sure that we have the right risk plans in place to mitigate any problems that might arise in the future. The next area, and again, Kathy alluded to this earlier, is getting that information down the supply chain quickly. So when I was a part of that study with the seating supply chain, we actually studied the amount of time it took from the information to get from the OEM down to, in this case, the Tier 4 supplier. It took on average 1 week per tier. So you can imagine at the lower level of the supply chain when you're getting information 1 month late, right? By then, many things could have changed. And so what they were doing was carrying just in case inventory. And so what, again, they wanted to have is they were really screaming to say, give us as much as the OEM is going to give you in that EDI data, and make sure you're communicating that to me as soon as you get that information. So the key thing here, again, is to be electronically communicating down the supply chain from the OEM down to the lower tier suppliers. In that study, what we found, once we implemented electronic communications throughout the supply chain, we took that from 1 month to 4 days. So the lower tiers were getting their information much more sooner than they were prior when we did it manually down the supply chain. And then the last area to really bring this all together, as I alluded to earlier, we need to be checking and following up. When I look between Tier 1 and lower, there's not often a very good way to assess supply chain processes throughout the supply chain. So we need to make sure that once a year we're looking at our long lead time and critical parts, and we're making sure, you know, inventory policies are being adhered to between each level of the supply chain. We need to ask for evidence of that. We want to make sure that there's enough planning information that's being passed from tier to tier, and we want to have evidence of that. So these are just some key things that we want to make sure that we're following up on all these processes to ensure that they're really happening within our supply chain. And lastly, what I want to talk about is what is the automation that we really need to have going forward in the future to not only mitigate these semiconductor issues, but also, as Kathy talked about before, to really support this internet or online buying of cars in the future. So there's 4 areas that you need to really consider technology. First of all is making sure that you have a good ERP. We want to make sure that you're not using spreadsheets internally or with suppliers. We know from the study that I had mentioned earlier, when you do it that way, there's all kinds of information lags and errors. So making sure that's all in place. And then also, all the processes that you have now documented, making sure how to use the system is in the ERP. So making sure that you've got all your processes documented on how to use all the screens and the technology within the system. So that's very key, especially now when we think about as employees come and go from organizations, that there's shortages and we've had a lot of turnover and skills gaps. We want to make sure that stays in the system. The next area that we want is a supplier relationship management tool. That's really key. You want that full visibility of your supply base. We want to look at things like quality, delivery, supplier mapping, performance, communication. We want that one place where we can put all of our information on our suppliers and they can also communicate with us really quickly. So that is a key thing that we want to have in the future as well too. Again, we want to automate that process. We don't want our quality and delivery data and performance data all over the organization. We want it in one spot. And that's also going to help your risk assessment in the future as well. The next area is scenario planning. So as we're looking at it, even today, sometimes I hear a lot of the semiconductor issues going to be resolved by the end of the year. Sometimes I hear it's going to not be until 2022. Regardless of which one is correct or not, your organization needs to be sitting down with your customers and in your suppliers and really looking at what's happening and making sure that you look at the different scenarios. You can do this planning within a tool, and once you have internally have all collaborated on it, you can put it in the system, and then now you've got your planning going forward for your long term especially. And what's really key about these scenario planning tools, it really does help you with the capacity planning too, which is a big concern right now as well. And then last but not least, having your ERP based on a platform. What does a platform mean? A platform allows you to apply advanced technology to digitize your supply chain. One of the key advanced technologies that I think is going to be very helpful in the future is machine learning, to be able to allow you to look at all that data, your quality and your supply chain data, and be able to mine that data behind the scenes to look for suppliers, as an example, who might be potentially at risk for you. And so instead of being reactive, we can now be predictive, and that's going to be so important in the future. And then also having the analytics. So having the platform allows you to have analytics. So when you have your first cup of coffee in the morning, you can see what the customers are doing, and then you can make sure that you're communicating that successfully down the supply chain. So to conclude here, to find out more information, and we've detailed it, all of what we shared with you today in our ebooks. They're available at qad.com/delivery, and we encourage you to go get copies of each of them for more information. And then also we have additional resources here for you. We've done a couple articles. Kathy and I were interviewed for the Daily Drive podcast by Automotive News, so we can hear more about us discussing this issue as well.
Y me gustaría poder dar un poco de comentarios acerca de lo que acabamos de ver en el video de Katy y de Terry. Y creo que los principales problemas que nosotros tenemos, recapitulando, es fluctuación de la demanda y pronósticos. Es muy difícil tener pronósticos adecuados si la demanda está subiendo y bajando de manera tan drástica. Pero obviamente esto lo podemos nosotros ver reflejado en esa comunicación de requerimientos. Tenemos que encontrar la manera de poder comunicar en tiempo, en forma y con la cantidad de datos requerida para comunicar requerimientos tanto a nuestros proveedores como a los subproveedores. Igualmente, la visibilidad de inventarios es sumamente importante. Debemos de tener manera de ver toda la capacidad que tenemos en la cadena de suministro para ver disponibilidad de inventarios, para que sepamos cuando va a haber algún problema o no de suministro e ir comunicando esos requerimientos a todos los niveles dentro de la cadena de suministro. Y finalmente, uno de los más importantes es vigilar esos tiempos de entrega. Si no estamos dando el horizonte completo de planeación para esas partes críticas o que tengan un tiempo de entrega muy largo, va a ser muy difícil que lo podamos hacer. Y aquí vemos en la lámina en color naranja, muchas veces tenemos procesos manuales. No tienen una idea de la cantidad de veces que visitamos a algún cliente automotriz y continúan utilizando hojas de Excel para planear producción, para planear los materiales. Es sumamente complicado el lograr una verdadera planeación utilizando hojas de Excel. Y lo mismo va para las herramientas de manejo de inventarios y la comunicación con la cadena de suministro. Tenemos que buscar la manera de que la comunicación sea en tiempo real, sin huecos, y poder evitar ese tipo de problemas. Igualmente nos platicaba Katy cómo se ha ido transformando la típica cadena de suministro y hoy día evoluciona a lo que llamamos el ecosistema de suministro automotriz. Ya no es solamente son los elementos materiales de materias primas que van al que fabrica, después van al que ensambla, después va al distribuidor y después va al consumidor. Ahora tenemos una serie de otros elementos, servicios, distribución, transporte, sistemas informáticos que vamos a ver involucrados y cada vez esta red se va haciendo cada vez más amplia y nosotros tenemos que estar preparados y con una buena comunicación para lograr que este ecosistema realmente funcione en nuestra cadena de suministro. Igualmente nos platicaba Katy de estos 24 procesos esenciales dentro de la cadena de suministro. Obviamente no los vamos a revisar uno por uno, pero quisiera sumarizarlo en estas 5 grandes elementos: planeación de negocio, planeación de programas, el poder planificar las operaciones que tenemos al interior de nuestra planta, igualmente cuáles son los controles que debemos tener al interior de la planta, pero también ir comunicando eso hacia los factores externos dentro de la cadena, es decir, clientes y proveedores. Y finalmente, y casi siempre vemos que esto se deja al último, son el medir el desempeño de los proveedores. Si no estamos midiendo el desempeño de los proveedores, no vamos a poder mejorar ese desempeño de los proveedores. Es muy importante tener este proceso de mejora continua en cada uno de nuestros proveedores. Y finalmente nos platicaban acerca de 5 consejos prácticos. Número 1, asegurar que la frecuencia y horizontes de planeación sean completos, sean adecuados. Hemos encontrado casos donde hay clientes que revisan su lista de materiales y su tiempo de entrega acumulado más largo se queda corto contra el horizonte que están enviando de planeación a sus proveedores. Es bien importante definir esto y también cuidar especialmente para las partes críticas. Igualmente tenemos que revisar y mantener buenas políticas de inventario y de compras. Esto es tanto al interior de nuestra planta y su operación, así como la comunicación con esos clientes y proveedores externos. El tercero es contar con planes de contingencia y evaluación de riesgos. Esto lo debemos hacer de manera sistemática. Cuando nos reunimos con algunos clientes, hacemos evaluaciones de MMGLE, los tienen. La realidad es que no son suficientemente robustos y casi siempre encontramos algunos huecos. El que sigue es la comunicación de requerimientos vía EDI o web. Es bien importante y es muy común que del OEM al Tier 1 sí lo tenemos vía EDI, pero ya del Tier 1 al Tier 2 y en adelante es difícil que tengamos comunicación vía EDI. Obviamente lo podemos nosotros llevar igualmente lo podemos mostrar nosotros también mediante un portal web que nos permita mostrar esto hacia adelante, ¿no? Y finalmente, el mantener un programa de evaluación a proveedores, hacer revisiones periódicas, medir los riesgos que existen y poder dar seguimiento a esas acciones correctivas. Muy bien, y ahora, ¿cómo es que QAD puede ayudarles? QAD, haciendo una historia muy breve, fue fundado en el año 79 con el objetivo de ayudar a empresas de manufactura. Hoy día se ha expandido de una manera muy grande y tenemos una gama muy completa de soluciones específicamente para la industria automotriz de manera integrada. Cubre requerimientos tanto de manufactura, de finanzas, de operaciones, calidad y todos los procesos de cadena de suministro y los ciclos comerciales. Estas soluciones, que son específicamente para la industria automotriz, están basadas en la nube y van muy de la mano con la transformación digital de las empresas para que logremos esa ventaja competitiva y esa capacidad para adaptarnos y aventajar a nuestros competidores en el mundo disruptivo en el que estamos viviendo. Entonces voy a darles un paseo muy rápido de estas soluciones. La primera de ellas se llama Dynasis, o es una gestión de planeación y cadena de suministro. Básicamente nos cubre los puntos de planeación de demanda, optimización de inventarios, planeación de suministro, planeación de la manufactura, planeación financiera y el muy conocido e importante plan de ventas y operaciones. Dynasis nos permite hacer esa simulación de pronósticos, simulación de escenarios que nos platicaba Terry en su participación, de tal manera que podamos anticiparnos mediante modelos de inteligencia artificial y machine learning esos cambios y podamos planear de manera adecuada y podamos tener ese análisis y comparación de datos para tomar decisiones informadas. El siguiente es el ERP adaptable en la nube. El ERP adaptable está basado en una plataforma, está diseñada específicamente para la industria de manufactura y con un enfoque muy principal a automotriz. Estamos cubriendo prácticamente todos los criterios de MMGLE, los tenemos mapeados a las aplicaciones de QAD y nos cubre todo el ciclo de automotriz, desde la recepción de requerimientos vía EDI, todo el proceso de recibo, transformación, diferentes tipos de manufactura, discreta, repetitiva, flujo, Kanban, etcétera, hasta que llega esto a los consumidores finales. Tenemos analíticos integrados que nos permiten utilizar esa información de la empresa para toma de decisiones. Me gustó mucho la frase que comentaba Terry, que mientras tomamos la primera taza de café en la mañana, podemos tener esos datos a la mano. Y todo esto en una interfase moderna y centrada en el usuario para poder adaptarnos rápidamente a las condiciones cambiantes que tenemos. El que sigue es nuestro sistema de gestión de calidad o el EQMS. Una suite muy completa cubriendo todos los requerimientos automotrices, IATF 16949, MMGLE, pero también ISO 9000, 14001, 45001, etcétera. Y nos ofrece desde control de documentos, administración de entrenamientos, acciones correctivas y preventivas, auditorías, todo el proceso de APQP, PPAP, gestión de riesgos, inspecciones, calibración de equipos, gestión de reclamaciones, etcétera. El que sigue es nuestra gestión de comercio y transporte global, o QA Precision, y son soluciones de comercio global, desde manejo de importaciones, exportaciones, acuerdos comerciales, regulaciones de libre comercio, el estar monitoreando restricciones, y todo lo concerniente a transportes, ejecución de los transportes, multitransportistas, excepciones de entregas, analíticos, etcétera. Tenemos un portal de proveedores donde se puede colaborar y tener visibilidad de toda la cadena de suministro. Esto nos permite responder rápidamente a esos cambios en el suministro y demanda, facilitando la comunicación en tiempo real entre los proveedores, la planta de producción, y da la capacidad a los proveedores de recibir tanto los requerimientos, también pueden generar ahí mismo ASNs, imprimir etiquetas de embarque, y tenemos métricas para poder estar monitoreando cómo van esos proveedores. Esto nos ayuda mucho a cumplir con lo que es el capítulo 6 de MMGLE, especialmente cuando los proveedores no tienen la capacidad de recibir transmisiones de EDI. También tenemos nuestra gestión de colaboración de proveedores, o el SRM de Allocation, y esto nos crea valor para los fabricantes de la industria automotriz al poder tener una mejor colaboración con proveedores, ya sean nuevos o existentes, de tal manera que tengamos fuentes de suministro óptimas, el poder responder rápidamente a los cambios en el suministro, y permite tener un punto central de comunicación en tiempo real, mejorando el proceso de compras y reduciendo los riesgos que pueden existir dentro del suministro. Incluye desde la gestión de proveedores, la habilitación, calificación y clasificación de proveedores, nuevos proveedores, y el desarrollo de estos nuevos proveedores. Incluye un módulo para el proceso electrónico, tanto de RFIs, RFQs, contratos, órdenes, y también tiene un módulo para el control de subastas y negociaciones con proveedores. Entonces aquí tenemos en resumen las diferentes soluciones que tenemos por parte de QAD. Adicional a esto me gustaría comentarles que QAD es el único proveedor autorizado por IAG y ODET para dar el entrenamiento de MMGLE en México. Sabemos que es un requisito de varios de los OEMs y es un paso necesario para obtener algunas certificaciones como el Q1 de Ford. Muy bien, y con esto me gustaría concluir esta sesión. En pantalla pueden ver mis datos. cualquier duda o pregunta que surgiera sobre esta presentación o algo en lo que nosotros podamos ayudarles en base a las soluciones que mostramos de QAD para la industria automotriz, nos dará muchísimo gusto poderlo revisar con ustedes. Si alguien gusta, también pues, me puede contactar por WhatsApp. Ahí están los datos. Así que muchísimas gracias por su atención y esperemos haber servido en algo y esperamos verlos pronto en otro de nuestros eventos. Muchísimas gracias.